The sound came first, a grinding, clanking rhythm that traveled through the mud and into the bones of every Marine lying in the defensive perimeter. Private First Class Michael Daly pressed his face into the wet earth and felt the vibration in his teeth. It was a sound they had all been dreading since they landed on this godforsaken island. The sound of Japanese tanks. The Type 95 Ha-Go emerged from the jungle like a steel beetle, its tracks churning through the vegetation, its 37 mm cannon sweeping back and forth searching for targets. Behind it came a second tank, then a third. A full armored platoon rolling toward the Marine positions with the confidence of machines that knew infantry rifles couldn't touch them. Corporal Eddie Tully watched the tanks approach and felt his stomach turn to ice water. His Springfield rifle was useless against that armor. The machine guns were useless. The grenades they had left were useless. Everything the Marines possessed was designed to kill men, not machines. And then his eyes fell on the weapon lying in the mud beside him. The weapon that everyone in the company had been trying to throw away since they landed on Guadalcanal 3 weeks ago. The boy's anti-tank rifle. 36 pounds of British steel and misery. A barrel so long it looked like a steam pipe welded to a wooden stock. A recoil so brutal that the Marines who fired it during training came away with bruised shoulders and ringing ears. The weapon had arrived on the island with a reputation that preceded it across the entire Pacific. They called it the shoulder breaker. They called it the elephant gun. They called it the most useless piece of equipment the British Empire had ever dumped on the United States Marine Corps. The boy's rifle had been designed in 1937 to stop tanks. German tanks. The kind of tanks that rolled across Poland and France with armor measured in inches. Against those modern war machines, the boy's rifle was a joke. The .55 caliber rounds would strike German panzer armor and bounce off like pebbles thrown at a battleship. British soldiers had tried to use them in the early campaigns and died for their efforts. The weapon had been labeled obsolete before America even entered the war. But the tanks rolling toward Tully's position weren't German. They were Japanese. And Japanese tanks were different. The Type 95 Ha-Go was the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Army's armor force. It was fast, maneuverable, and perfectly suited for the jungle warfare of the Pacific. It was also, by European standards, barely armored at all. The thickest point on the hull was 12 millimeters. The sides were 6 millimeters. A German panzer commander would have laughed at those numbers. A German infantryman would have considered the Type 95 a death trap. But the Marines on Guadalcanal didn't have German weapons. They had Springfields and BARs and machine guns that would bounce off even the Type 95's thin skin. The only weapon in their inventory that could theoretically penetrate that armor was the one they had been trying to abandon since they landed. The one lying in the mud beside Eddie Tully. "Give me the boys," Tully shouted, grabbing the rifle and dragging it toward his fighting position. The weight was staggering. 36 pounds of steel and wood, plus the 5-round magazine loaded with tungsten cord armor-piercing ammunition. It felt like carrying a small child made entirely of iron. "That thing doesn't work," Private Henderson shouted back. The British abandoned it for a reason. The British were fighting German tanks. These aren't German tanks. The lead Type 95 was 100 yards away now. Its machine gun was already firing, raking the Marine positions with short bursts. The 37 mm cannon was elevating, searching for a target worth the expenditure of a shell. Tully slammed the bipod into the mud and dropped behind the weapon. The stock was massive, designed to absorb the legendary recoil. But even with the padded butt plate, it was going to hurt. The bolt was stiff and heavy, requiring genuine strength to cycle. The trigger pull was terrible. Everything about the weapon was terrible, except for what it fired. The .55 caliber cartridge was a monster. The round itself was nearly half an inch in diameter, propelled by a powder charge that produced a muzzle velocity of 3,250 feet per second. The tungsten core was designed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to punch through armor through sheer kinetic violence. Tully lined up the crude iron sights on the front glacis of the lead tank. 80 yards. The armor there was at its thickest, 12 millimeters of steel plate at a slight angle. The penetration tables he had never bothered to read said the boys could punch through 21 millimeters at 100 yards. The math was in his favor. He just had to trust it. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil was biblical, even with the massive stock absorbing part of the energy. The impact slammed into Tully's shoulder like a kick from a mule. His vision blurred. His ears rang. The muzzle blast threw up a cloud of mud and debris that momentarily blinded him. But he saw the impact. The .55 caliber round struck the Type 95's glasses plate dead center. It didn't bounce off. It didn't glance away. It punched through the armor like a needle through cloth and disappeared inside the tank. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank kept rolling forward. The crew inside seemed unaware that anything had occurred. And then, the tank began to slow. What happened inside that steel box was a phenomenon that military engineers called spalling. When a hardened projectile penetrates armor at high velocity, it doesn't enter the interior as a single clean projectile. The impact creates a cone of metal fragments that sprays inward from the penetration point. These fragments travel at thousands of feet per second, ricocheting off the interior surfaces, shredding everything in their path. The .55 caliber round had entered the tank cleanly, but the steel it pushed ahead of it, the spall cone created by the impact, had turned the interior into a blender. The driver was killed instantly. The machine gunner beside him took fragments to the face and throat. The commander in the turret was hit by secondary ricochets that bounced off the ammunition storage. The engine began to smoke as fragments severed fuel lines and electrical connections. The Type 95 rolled to a stop. Black smoke began pouring from the hull. The hatches never opened. Nobody came out. The other tanks stopped advancing. The crews had seen what happened to their comrade. They had heard the distinctive boom of the anti-tank rifle, a sound unlike anything else on the battlefield. They were trying to understand what weapon the Americans possessed that could do this to an armored vehicle. Tully worked the bolt of the boy's rifle. The action was stiff, the brass casing ejecting with a metallic clang that echoed across the perimeter. He slammed another round into the chamber and acquired the second tank. The recoil was just as brutal as before. The impact was just as devastating. The round punched through the turret ring, the weakest point in the tank's protection, and detonated the ammunition stored inside. The secondary explosion blew the turret off the hull and sent it spinning into the jungle like a steel frisbee. The third tank tried to reverse. The driver threw it into reverse gear and gunned the engine, desperate to escape the killing ground. The tracks churned mud as the machine fought to back away from the monster that was destroying its platoon. Tully tracked it with the boy's rifle. The iron sights were crude, just simple post and notch alignment. The weapon had no scope, because adding optical equipment to a rifle with this much recoil would be pointless. Everything was done by eye and instinct. He led the reversing tank slightly, accounting for its movement, and fired. The round caught the Type 95 in the side armor, the thinnest plate on the vehicle. 6 millimeters of steel offered no resistance at all. The .55 caliber tungsten core passed through both sides of the tank, entering the left hull and exiting through the right, carrying with it a spray of spall that killed the driver and commander before either of them could scream. 3 tanks, 3 kills, 60 seconds. The Marines in the defensive positions were staring with expressions of pure disbelief. The weapon they had mocked for weeks, the British cast-off that everyone wanted to throw into the ocean, had just destroyed an entire armored platoon with surgical precision. Tully released the bolt and let the boy's rifle fall silent. The barrel was warm from the rapid firing. His shoulder was already beginning to bruise. His ears were ringing so badly that he could barely hear the cheering from the Marines around him. "Henderson," he shouted at the private who had told him the weapon didn't work. "Still think we should throw this thing away?" Henderson didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the smoking wrecks of 3 Japanese tanks. The story spread through the Marine positions within hours. By the next morning, every unit on Guadalcanal knew about the anti-tank rifle that had stopped an armored assault. The weapon that had been labeled useless, obsolete, and embarrassing had suddenly become the most valuable piece of equipment on the island. The transformation was remarkable. Marines who had refused to carry the boy's rifle were now volunteering for anti-tank duty. Men who had complained about the weight and the recoil were now practicing with it daily, learning to absorb the punishment in exchange for the ability to kill tanks. The shoulder breaker became the tank killer. The steam pipe became the armored needle. The secret of the boys' rifle's success in the Pacific was simple but rarely discussed by military historians. The weapon had been designed to fight a different war. Against the thick armor of German tanks, it was genuinely useless. The .55 caliber round couldn't penetrate a Panzer III from any angle, let alone the heavier Tigers and Panthers that would dominate the European theater. But the Japanese had made different choices in their armored doctrine. They prioritized speed and mobility over protection. They designed tanks for jungle warfare and infantry support, not the open tank battles of the European plains. The Type 95 and Type 97 tanks that formed the backbone of their armor force were death traps against a weapon like the boys' rifle. The physics that made the British weapon obsolete in Europe made it devastatingly effective in the Pacific. The tungsten cord rounds that bounced off German steel punched through Japanese armor with ease. The spalling effect that was negligible against thick plate became lethal against thin walls. The range that was insufficient against German tanks was more than adequate for the close-quarters jungle combat of the island campaigns. The boys' rifle had found its golden age. For a brief period in 1942 and early 1943, the weapon that everyone wanted to throw away became one of the most feared tools in the Marine arsenal. Japanese tank crews learned to dread the distinctive boom of the .55 caliber rifle. They learned that their armor, which had protected them from rifle fire and machine guns, was worthless against the armored needle. They learned that the Americans possessed a weapon that could kill their tanks from positions they couldn't even see. The golden age ended, of course. By mid-1943, the bazooka had arrived in the Pacific in significant numbers. The rocket launcher was lighter, easier to use, and could be operated by soldiers without the upper body strength required to fire the boys' rifle. The punishing recoil and awkward handling that had always plagued the British weapon became unacceptable when better alternatives existed. The boys' rifle was quietly retired from frontline service. It was relegated to training duties and rear area defense. The weapon that had saved the Marines at Guadalcanal was stored in armories and eventually scrapped. But the men who had been there remembered. Tully finished the war as a staff sergeant with 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He rarely spoke about the specific engagements that had earned him recognition. When people asked about his most memorable moment of the war, he would sometimes talk about a rainy morning on Guadalcanal, when 3 Japanese tanks rolled out of the jungle, expecting to massacre a rifle company. He would talk about the weapon that everyone hated, the steam pipe, the shoulder breaker. The British cast-off that no American Marine wanted to carry. He would describe the weight of it in his hands, the brutal kick against his shoulder, the boom that echoed across the jungle like artillery. And he would describe the moment when the first tank stopped rolling, the moment when the spall cone did its work inside the steel box, the moment when he realized that the most useless weapon in the Marine Corps was about to save every man in his company. They called it weak, he would say, finishing his drink. They called it obsolete. They called it a waste of 36 pounds. And then the tanks came, and it was the only thing we had. Funny how that works, isn't it? The thing everybody hates is the thing that saves you. The burden you want to throw away is the burden that keeps you alive. The boys' anti-tank rifle was never praised by military historians. It remained a footnote in the story of World War II, mentioned only as an example of weapons that failed to keep pace with armored development. The official assessments called it inadequate, outmoded, and poorly designed. The official assessments never mentioned Guadalcanal. They never mentioned the 3 tanks destroyed in 60 seconds. They never mentioned the Marine raiders who discovered that a weapon is only obsolete if you're using it against the wrong enemy. Sometimes the battlefield decides what matters. Sometimes the weapon that failed in one theater becomes legend in another. Sometimes the steam pipe that everyone mocked becomes the only thing standing between a company of Marines and annihilation. The .55 caliber tungsten round didn't care about official assessments. It cared about armor thickness and impact velocity, and the physics of spalling. And against Japanese tanks in the jungles of the Pacific, that physics worked perfectly. The sound of a weapon nobody wanted becoming the weapon everybody needed. The sound of 36 pounds of British steel punching through Japanese armor. The sound of a golden age that nobody expected, and nobody could deny. If Tully's story of mastering a hated weapon hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that Marines who turn British cast-offs into tank killers deserve to be remembered. If you're not subscribed, now is the time, because next week we're uncovering another obsolete weapon that found its moment of redemption. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If you were staring down 3 approaching tanks with nothing but a 36-pound rifle everyone said was useless, would you trust the physics or run for cover? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.